Hey kids, George Washington here again. Today I want to tell you about defending the frontier. I told you last time about how upsetting it was to be demoted from commander of the Virginia Regiment and given the captainship of only 1/3 of the force. I admit it. I was peeved. Maybe the military life wasn't for me. I could go to the family estate at Mount Vernon, become a gentleman farmer, maybe still do some speculating, little land speculating, and use my surveying skills. It just didn't seem like the military was going to work out. I had a new path in life. Well, and then General Braddock got in touch with me. You see, General Braddock had been sent over from England with a force of British regulars to join up with the colonial forces and drive the French from Fort Duquesne. I got an invitation from the general to meet him in Winchester, and I could not resist. General Braddock very graciously hosted me with wining and dining in the most elegant manner. You see, he then asked me to serve as his personal aide. I was going to be in a position where I could learn about British strategy and technique of the military kind, and I would almost be like a family member as his aide. Really, any rank was irrelevant at this point. So I marched with General Braddock and his force towards Fort Duquesne. Well, let me tell you, this expedition was a disaster. The French met us at the Monongahela River. General Braddock was totally unprepared for French and Indian techniques of the wilderness. The British were totally routed in a panic, having lost 2/3 of their men, and General Braddock himself was mortally wounded. I ordered him buried under the very road we were building to go to Fort Duquesne. The British officer second in command was so demoralized, he sent the entire British forces to winter quarters all the way in Philadelphia, even though it was the middle of summer at this point. Well, as you can imagine, Governor Dinwiddie could not accept that the remaining British force had abandoned the field to the French. He immediately petitioned the House of Burgesses for money and funds to raise a force of Virginians to go out again into the frontier. I was offered the command, and he met several of my conditions before I would accept. But on acceptance, I moved on to Winchester to establish my headquarters for my frontier command. My assignment was daunting. I was to organize the defense of the entire frontier, all the way from the Potomac to the border with North Carolina. With the abandonment of the frontier by the British forces, many settlers retreated eastward over the mountains into the Shenandoah Valley. Those that were left in the Alleghenies were even more exposed to attacks from French and Indian marauders. I had two major challenges. First, I was told to establish a chain of forts to defend this frontier. Secondly, I was to build a militia that could man these forts and defend them. Well, the recruitment of militia members was very difficult. The laws allowed the wealthy to avoid service, and the pay was minimal. These conditions essentially favored the very poor and uneducated as recruits. Many that came didn't even own shoes or coats. These men would have needed to be cared for by the colonial government had they not been in the militia. The length of service was so short that as soon as they were trained, they had almost fulfilled their commitment. And those that did stay, well, they often deserted. Re-enlistments were rare. Well, I did manage to mount a military force in spite of these problems, but it was a continual struggle. Well, as to the forts, well, you could hardly even call them that. Many were crude structures built speedily with limited materials and equipment. Others were private homes that were modified by their owners with defensive features. One of the more elaborate defenses was the stockade at Fort Edwards and Capon Bridge. Edwards had built a stockade around his house, his barn, all his outbuildings, and his spring. This was pretty impressive. Also in West Virginia, in the northern part of the state, was Fort Ashby. That was a fort that I actually had the militia build. It was still very crude, and today there is a town in northern West Virginia that bears its name. But right here in the Eastern Panhandle are two of the private landowner forts that you can still see today. In downtown Martinsburg, you can see the residence that was Fort Mendenhall. And just a little south of town, on Route 11, is what was once Fort Evans. Fort Evans was a stone house that you can see right from the side of the road if you go down Route 11 today. These forts provided some defense, but they were spread a day's march apart and were very difficult to supply and administer. In spite of these challenges, we did our best to defend the frontier with our militia. During these times after Braddock's defeat in 1775, we had about 10 military skirmishes and lost a total of around 100 men. At the same time I was defending the Virginia frontier with the local militia, the British changed their strategy on driving the French from the American colonies. There were to be 3 campaigns. The campaign to overtake Fort Duquesne was led by General Forbes. General Forbes had much experience with organized campaigns that were well thought out and supplied. He took his time, made sure his supplies were kept up with him, and he had his chain of supplies, men, and troops all administered in a way that were organized and not strung out. You see, I was to lead the 1st Virginia Company, and William Byrd was to lead the 2nd Virginia Company. We would both work under General Forbes. This was to be a combined force of between 6,000 and 7,000 men. I really did like the strategy of a well-organized force marching towards Fort Duquesne. However, I did not like the route he chose to take. He wanted to build a brand new road through the wilderness, starting in Pennsylvania, all the way to the forks of the Ohio. I was in favor of extending the Braddock Road, which we had already carved out of the wilderness in Virginia. Well, actually, to be honest, I knew whichever road was chosen would eventually lead trade to the east, and I wanted to see this trade come to Virginia. I had investments that would be helpful to me were this trade to come. However, alas, I did not win that argument. So General Forbes pushed on through Pennsylvania. During that march, I learned a lot about how to sustain a large campaign. I would draw from this knowledge later in my experience in the American Revolution. Well, as we began to approach the forks of the Ohio, the French commander was getting worried about his ability to defend Fort Duquesne. The nearby Fort Frontenac had recently fallen, and his supply chain was cut. So, because of all of this, he decided to abandon the fort, and using the magazines in the fort, he blew it up on November 23rd, 1758. The next day, our forces marched into the smoldered and abandoned ruins. It had been 3 years since the disastrous defeat of Braddock on the Monongahela. And now, finally, the British and Virginia Regiment had overtaken the forks of the Ohio. And at this point, the French had begun the slow loss of this war. I, once again, abandoned and resigned my military post. I had recently won a seat in the House of Burgesses representing Frederick County, and Mary Custis had accepted my proposal to marriage. So in January, I was to be married, and in February, I would join the legislature and take my seat. So, my friends, this ends my early life and my time in the Eastern Panhandle. I was to move on to the American Revolution and exploits up and down the coastal colonies that would bring on. I would still do some speculating and surveying in the Eastern Panhandle across my life. Also, many of my family settled in the Eastern Panhandle and would have a lingering impact on the region. I will always appreciate the experience I received and the skills I developed in this region. Well, thank you. And I hope you have enjoyed this series on my life in the Eastern Panhandle of West Virginia. For now, this is George Washington saying, so long, and please come visit the museum.